On the night of the 19th of January 1915, bombs fell on the East Anglian towns of Great Yarmouth, Sheringham, and King's Lynn. This came as a great surprise to their residents. The last time anything interesting had happened there was a Viking raid in 865 AD. The intended target had been the docks and industry of the Humber estuary, but the airships that had dropped those bombs had been blown off course and elected to bomb a tea shop instead. 4 people were killed and nearly £8,000 of damage was done. The English press reacted with fury and indignation. Dropping bombs on people was not British or sporting. Enough, they declared, of that sort of thing. And for a time, it seemed that strong words had done the trick. In reality, the Germans had merely been repeatedly foiled by bad weather, poor navigation, and the older technology in the Zeppelins they had to hand. On the 29th of April, they returned, hitting Ipswich and then Southend on the 9th of May. The night of the 30th of May saw London hit for the first time. By this point, quite a lot of people in Britain were actively cross. Questions were asked in Parliament. Something must be done to prevent these gas bags raining high explosives down on fine, upstanding British subjects. On the south coast, one man heard their clarion call for aid. That man, Noel Pemberton-Billing, generally occupied a kind of twilight zone between conceptual genius, entrepreneurial spirit, and charlatanism. He was also a prospective Tory MP and was not beyond using war causes to further his ambition. In this case, the product of his peculiar brand of inspiration was one of the most remarkable combat aircraft to ever take flight, the PB-31 Nighthawk. Or more correctly, as Pemberton-Billing sold it up before it first flew, the Supermarine Nighthawk. Noel Pemberton-Billing was, of course, the founder of the company that gave the world the Spitfire. The Nighthawk is therefore its Neanderthal ancestor. Attacking a Zeppelin might at first seem quite trivial. They are very large and very slow, with the common P-class Zeppelin only capable of 39 miles per hour on a cruise and under 60 flat out. But the Zeppelins had 2 advantages. They attacked at night, and they flew very high, well over 11,000 feet in the case of the P, and 13,000 feet in the case of the Q-class. Although a contemporary biplane fighter like the Bristol Scout could theoretically climb to that altitude, it took more than 20 minutes to get there. Its speed advantage was only 30 to 40 miles per hour, meaning that an intercept would need to be very carefully planned. All of this is explicitly not saying that the pilot also had to take off, navigate to the intercept point, attack, and then land again, all with close to zero visibility. Only searchlights illuminating the Zeppelin aided him in his mission. Pemberton-Billing's solution was twofold. First, the issues of the Zeppelin's high altitude could be countered by both shooting a high-caliber weapon upwards at it and by having the aircraft already on station in the vicinity of a potential raid, ready to either spot directly or rapidly position itself for action. The aircraft thus needed to be large to carry the required weapon and to fire it accurately, and it had to have radar equipment to communicate with the ground. It also needed to be able to fly at very low speeds in order to cruise around efficiently at altitude while patrolling for Zeppelins and to enable it to land safely on a poorly lit strip at night. Low speed in his book was just 35 miles per hour. In one quote, he described the aircraft as being intended to stand still in a 28 mile per hour breeze and lie in wait for the Zeppelins. In fact, he had already set out his vision for the aeroplane in his book, The Defense of the Great Cities by Night, which would be published in 1916 after the demise of the initial PB-29E. By night, he stated, a fleet of defending aeroplanes is necessary. Each machine must be armed as so to be capable of destroying an airship at a range equal to the range of its own searchlight, which must be not less than 1 mile. It must also carry a searchlight driven independently of the engines. it must have a speed of 80 miles per hour in order to overtake airships. Furthermore, he specified endurance of 12 hours, silenced engines, and an ability to operate above 10,000 feet for at least 20 minutes. Great Britain would need 50 of these aircraft, plus 50 pilots on duty and 25 in reserve. That would presumably mean 25 aircraft on alert each night. With the Zeppelin menace at hand, Noel Pemberton-Billing was ready to design the solution he had already described. He did, however, hit an immediate snag. In order to make himself appear more heroic, and thus electable, he had volunteered for the embryonic Royal Naval Air Service. That put designing an aircraft somewhat out of sync with his everyday responsibilities. Fortunately, this was just a test of persuasion, the kind of endeavour for which PB was uniquely equipped. He was able to convince the Navy to second him to aircraft design indefinitely. Doubly convenient was that this would shortly coincide with an opportunity to compete for elected officialdom. To this end, his PB-29 was drawn out as a quadruplane with 4 very high aspect ratio wings. The whole wing was of 2-bay construction and all 4 main planes had ailerons for control. The bottom wing was a complete span that passed underneath the fuselage, whereas the rest were of more conventional build. The upper wing was longer than the other 3, being 60 foot long versus 57 feet. Outboard of the engines, all 4 wings were swept back by 10 degrees. Attached to this was a large fuselage at 36 feet 10.5 inches long, but the nose was short to improve visibility for landing. It was of all wooden construction with a stretched fabric skin. There were 2 cockpits in tandem housing 2 pilots with dual controls. This was necessary because of the long mission duration that Pemberton-Billing envisaged. Aft of the cockpit, the fuselage tapered and became triangular in cross-section, terminating in a biplane horizontal tail with triple vertical tails and rudders. Power came from a pair of 90 horsepower 6-cylinder water-cooled Austro-Daimler engines mounted in pusher configuration. They were mounted in nacelles attached to the underside of the lowest but one wing, and they drove 4-bladed 9-foot diameter propellers. Fuel tanks were located in the fuselage, and the main landing gear was located directly beneath the engine nacelles, giving a nice, stable, wide track for night landings. Armament was a 303 Lewis gun. The gunner stood in a streamlined enclosure between the upper pair of wings. This position gave him an outstanding 360-degree field of view above the aircraft. And in order to attack Zeppelins, the 303 would have fired tracer ammunition. If it had ever actually been used for its intended purpose, then the Lewis gun's lack of range would have been problematic, as would the effects of the stream of tracer on the gunner's night vision. The nacelle for the gunner, incidentally, was completely separate from the main fuselage, meaning that the gunner was alone with his thoughts during the flight. Presumably the very First World War technique of yelling and waving one's arms would have been employed to communicate between the 2 crew cabins. Legend has it that this mighty aircraft was designed and constructed at the Woolston Works in just 7 weeks. If it's anything like other tales of Pemberton-Billing genius, then it's more likely that a great deal of pre-work had already taken place. One way or the other, the finished aircraft was delivered to Chingford in Essex on January the 1st, 1916, and it first flew on Sunday the 16th, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Sidney Pickles, who would later go on to be the chief test pilot at Fairey. This fact is only recorded, by the way, because Pemberton-Billing was giving a speech on the same day as he contested a by-election at Mile End, and he mentioned the flight. As I said, Supermarine was definitely as much of a playing piece in his political career as it was a useful aviation company at this stage. Whatever its motivations, though, the PB-29E's first flight was also the first flight by a quadruplane. Although underpowered, it performed reasonably well, and it was subsequently flown by several Royal Navy pilots, including J.W. Snedden. One criticism of the aircraft in this configuration, though, was that the tail area lacked structural rigidity because of that triangular configuration. Partially because of that, it was ultimately destroyed in an accident sometime in 2016. The exact date is unrecorded because the PB-29E never actually received a Royal Naval Air Service serial number. And yes, I do mean Royal Naval Air Service. It was actually the Navy that was responsible for hunting down Zeppelins because the Zeppelins belonged to the Imperial German Navy. Although faintly mad, the PB-29E displayed sufficient promise that the Admiralty agreed to a second attempt. This aircraft was designated the PB-31, and it would eventually be known as the Nighthawk. Pemberton-Billing had now sold the Supermarine Company and he left for Westminster. The PB-39 would thus be penned by one R.J. Mitchell, beginning on the 20th of May 1916. Nighthawk retained the quadruplane configuration but sensibly adopted a 3-bay design for extra strength. The weak triangular rear fuselage was altered to make the cross-section square from nose to tail. The pilots now occupied a luxurious, fully glazed cockpit below the lower wing trailing edge. Glazing extended onto the fuselage sides to afford the pilots with a good view down on landing. Notable as well was the provision of a bed so that the crew members could take a rest during long flights, another first as far as I'm aware. All internal structural members were now taped and clothed with fabric to protect the crew from splinters in the event that the aircraft took hits. It's all very reminiscent of a warship, which in fairness was more akin to the Nighthawk in scale than a contemporary fighter. The upper nacelle was now connected to the main fuselage and it rose to the top of the upper wing surface, so it's a much bigger cabin. That cabin now occupied the entire space between the second and third wings. A 1.5-pound Davis gun was mounted at the front of the upper works on a traversing mount. The Davis gun was a somewhat Heath Robinson-style recoilless gun developed by one Commander Cleland Davis of the US Navy. In fairness to it and to him, it was also the first practical recoilless gun. It's essentially two guns back to back, with one carrying the projectile, in this case it was a 37mm or 1.5-pound shell, and the other a combination of lead shot and grease with the same weight as the shell. It was loaded by breaking the gun in the middle, with the unique shell being twice the size of a normal 37mm round. When it fired, the main projectile went out of the front towards the enemy, and the rest of the stuff went out the back towards you. The gunner therefore fired the weapon from the shoulder unless he had some sort of death wish. In the PB-31, it was aimed with an open sight. Muzzle velocity was only 1,200 feet per second, which was only about half that of 37mm naval guns of the period and just over half that of a Lewis gun. Fortunately, of course, Zeppelins were slow-moving. 10 rounds were carried. Some sources have it that it was actually a 2-pound gun, but that's due to some confusion caused by the second prototype, which was intended to be armed with the 2-pounder. The mount was described as being a double parallel sliding bed, allowing practically any arc of fire. A 37mm explosive shell would have likely caused catastrophic damage to a Zeppelin's gas bags, so you can see why it was favoured over the 303 despite the accuracy compromises. As well as the big gun, the PB-31 carried a revolving dispenser for parachute flares that dropped one flare every 20 feet when activated. This was manufactured by the HMV Gramophone Company, and it had been patented in 1915. The idea was to fly over the Zeppelin and drop the flares on it, igniting the gas bag. As far as I'm aware, though, the flare dispenser was never fitted. Since the Nighthawk was actually incapable of flying over Zeppelins, in normal circumstances it would have been a waste of weight. Behind the upper deck gunner and ahead of the pilot were Lewis gunners with their weapons mounted on scarf rings. These were for defence of the aircraft against German seaplanes, as the Admiralty also intended for it to be used to defend against Zeppelins attacking the battle fleet. 6 ammunition drums per gun, containing 97 rounds each, were carried. A later Supermarine brochure claimed that 4 guns were carried, but that was fanciful. A searchlight was also carried forward of the nose Lewis gun on a gimbal mount, and it was powered by the first known example of an auxiliary power unit in an aircraft. In this case, it was a 5-horsepower ABC engine. That searchlight also had some use to illuminate night landings. It required a starburst arrangement of intakes to feed it, leading to an interesting set of nose decorations. Control of the searchlight was via a Bowden cable, which enabled it to be pointed in elevation and azimuth. The main engines were also upgraded to 100-horsepower 9-cylinder Anzani radials, which were in tractor now rather than pusher configuration. The extra power was needed to propel the 6,146-pound machine. That included over 2,000 pounds of fuel in 9 tanks in the fuselage. They could be used interchangeably to give redundancy, and the fuel lines and engine controls were armoured against battle damage. Again, it's as if Mitchell and the other designers were envisaging a pitched battle similar to that between lines of battleships. Overall, it was very similar in dimensions to the PB-29, although it was reportedly considerably heavier. We don't actually have a weight number for PB-29. Tests at Royal Naval Air Station Eastchurch established that the top speed was 75 miles per hour, patrol speed was between 55 and 60, and its landing speed was 35 miles an hour. Endurance was 9 hours under normal circumstances, but it could be raised to a remarkable 18 hours if care was taken. One prototype of this odd machine was built, taking to the air in February 1917 at the hands of one Clifford Prodger, Cliff to his friends. Although a second had been ordered, it was never built, with the Admiralty preferring to pursue the use of more conventional aircraft in anti-Zeppelin roles. The sole prototype was stricken on the 23rd of July 1917 and scrapped shortly thereafter. During the course of the Great War, 51 Zeppelin raids were made on the British mainland. They dropped 5,806 bombs, killing 557 people and injuring 1,358. To put that into perspective, just one Gotha raid of 20 bombers on the 13th of June 1917 killed 162 people and injured 432. The worst day of the London Blitz was on the night of the 10th and 11th of March 1941, in which 571 sorties by German bombers killed approximately 1,400 people and seriously injured 1,800. So in historical context, the Zeppelin menace was thus a public relations crisis more than a significant threat to life. Despite their numerous innovations, the Pemberton-Billing PB-29 and 31 were thus more public relations aircraft than realistic interceptors. But that suited their creator just fine.